we're streaming live on YouTube. And tonight's, we're going to be looking at the book of Exodus, which is, sorry, not the book of Exodus, book of Numbers. I've just been, my son and I are currently reading through the book of Numbers, and he said, once you finish, Dave, come up, can we read the book of Numbers tonight? Because it's been a bit of a busy one with various things that are going on. Anyway, thank you to the 16 of you that are in the Zoom so far. There's more coming in. David, thank you for joining us, and Donna as well. Great to have you with us, and various ones. Santi as well from South Africa. Wonderful to see you all here with us. Let's dive into the book of Numbers. Now, this is it's an interesting name in and of itself, but it's actually taken from the Greek and is derived from the fact that on two occasions a census was taken, chapters 1 to 4 and chapters 26. The first was taken at Sinai, and the second on the banks of the Jordan. The Hebrew title, however, comes from the opening sentence of the book, in the wilderness, and this title is the more appropriate of the two, as we shall see later on. In the wilderness being very, very key component to what goes on in the book of Numbers. Numbers describes events before and after the wanderings in the wilderness, of which we have little knowledge. It takes us from Mount Sinai, where the book of Exodus ends, to the borders of Canaan at the River Jordan near Jericho, where Joshua begins. It takes us right up to the point prior to the crossing into the promised land. In Numbers, we find that God has taken another step in realizing his purpose, his plan. He speaks not out of the tent of meeting, as he did in the book of Exodus to Moses, but he speaks to Moses in the tent of meeting. For the first time, we are viewed as being within the house of God in a responsible way. And we are also shown that everything depends upon his faithfulness and our responsibility. So with that, let's look, as we have done in the previous sessions, at the authorship and date. It is generally considered the work of Moses, and well, it generally is the work of Moses. Turn with me to Numbers chapter 1. That's where we'll begin. Numbers chapter 1. Verse 1 says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses. And then in chapter 36, we have right at the end, 36, verse 13. These are the commandments and the ordinances which the Lord commanded by Moses unto the children of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. So we see here Moses at the very beginning and Moses at the end, and that's important for us as we unpack that. It was written somewhere between 1440 BC to 1300 BC, and it covers a period of about 38 years, as can be seen from the following dates. And so there are dates within the book that give us an indication of this. Numbers 1:1 says the first day of the 12th month in the second year. And that's, it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt. And so turn back with me to Exodus 40, verse 17, just quickly. Exodus 40, verse 17 says this, and it came to pass in the first month, in the second year, on the first day of the month, that the tabernacle was reared up. So we have the tabernacle being built on the first day, in the first month, in the second year, on the first day, and then we have in the second, in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they would come out of the land of Egypt. So we see this direct correlation between the end of Exodus 40 verse 17 and Numbers 1:1. And then Numbers 10 verse 11. Turn with me to Numbers 10 verse 11. It says this, Numbers 10 verse 11. And it came to pass in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th day of the month, that the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle of the testimony. Okay, so this is a point when the cloud lifted. And then Numbers 33, verse 18, and these will give us an indication of the timing and how long the duration of the book was written. Numbers 33, verse 18, and they journeyed from Hazeroth and encamped in Rithmah. Let me just see, that's 33, verse 38. My apologies, 33, verse 38. And Aharon the priest went up into Mount Hor at the commandment of the Lord and died there in the 40th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 5th month, on the 1st day of the month. So that gives an indication that Aaron died. And then turn over to Deuteronomy 1, verse 3. Deuteronomy 1, verse 3, and we'll be looking at Deuteronomy tomorrow night. Deuteronomy 1, verse 3. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the 1st day of the month, that Moses spoke unto the children of Israel, according unto all that the Lord had given him in commandment unto them. So we have Moses' farewell, his departure from Horeb, and his farewell. So notice that no dates are given in the whole account from the 2nd year and the 40th year, which is interesting. So there's 38 years that we know that actually the dates aren't, in one sense, the dates aren't significant. They're not taken notice of. We know, of course, they are because of the account, but there's no date specifically given between 2nd and the 40th year. So this book can chronologically be divided into the following: Numbers 1 to 14, 1 year. Numbers 15 to 20, 36 to 37 years. And then Numbers 20 to Numbers 36 all took place within a year. It's interesting to note that the wilderness wanderings, for the most part, are not on record. So with that, let's look at the key to the book. It is hard to find in Numbers the key to the book, for we find so much running through it. We've got God's faithfulness and our failure. We've got warfare and conflict. We've got rebellion and division, pilgrimage and service, trial and probation. In Numbers 1:1 and 12 verse 7, however, we find what it is that God is drawing our attention to, and it's this. So turn with me again. We'll just read Numbers 1:1 again, because it gives us a clue. In the wilderness. So we have that very first statement. The Lord spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, on the 1st day of the 2nd month, in the 2nd year that they would come out of the land of Egypt. And then it goes on. So we have that statement, in the wilderness. And then in Numbers 12, verse 7, Numbers 12, verse 7, we have, my servant Moses is not so. He is faithful in all my house. And this whole passage talks again about the tent of meeting. So we have this statement. We've got in the wilderness, in the tent of meeting, and he is faithful in all my house. So it's this understand that responsibility really is the key. And we'll look at that a little bit in more detail. We've got responsibility as the key, responsibility towards the Lord, responsibility over the things of God. And this responsibility, furthermore, is on probation. And wherever we turn in Numbers, we discover that all are on trial as to this question. Moses is on trial, Aaron's on trial, Miriam, the priests, the Levites, the princes, the elders, and the people are all seemingly on trial. We ought to note that the book begins and ends with a numbering of the people from 20 years old and upwards. Now, this is interesting. Why? Have you ever stopped and thought, why 20 years old? I think it's revealing to us that there is a desire of God and an intention of God that we should all grow up. We should all take full responsibility for and in God's house. He's not content with a community of just babies. He wants people who are 20 years old and up, who have responsibility for his house, responsibility for the tent of meeting, taking inward and practical responsibility for the things of God and the people of God. For his dwelling place is in fact the heart of true service. We ought to note also that the Levites occupy a very prominent place in this book. In the Bible, they always represent responsibility in the house of God. Their service towards God is in a special way begun with the incident in Exodus 32, verse 25 to 29. Tell me there, Exodus 32, verse 25 to 29. You may be familiar with this, but this is where it really began for the Levites. And when Moses saw that the people were broken loose, for Aaron had let them loose, for a derision or a whispering among their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And he said unto them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, put you every man his sword upon his thigh, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, every man his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell on of the people that day about 3,000 men. And Moses said, "Consecrate yourselves today to the Lord. Yes, every man against his son and against his brother, he may bestow upon you a blessing this day." And if we go back into Numbers and chapter 3, Numbers chapter 3, verse 11 to 13. Numbers chapter 3, verse 11 to 13. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I behold, I have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel, instead of all the firstborn that opened the womb among the children of Israel. And the Levites shall be mine, for all the firstborn are mine, on the day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. I hallowed unto me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. Mine they shall be. I am the Lord." So he took the Levites as being those that have a responsibility before him. We see then in the book of Numbers 3 things: responsibility, probation, and rebellion. But shining through all is the faithfulness of God. And I don't want to take too much time, but if you want, of course, Numbers being 36 chapters in total, there is a great summary of it, and it's found in, you guessed it, the book of Psalms. Psalm 78 gives us a summary of the whole of the book of Numbers, which I think is amazing, just in one passage. It's headed in the American Standard Version as God's guidance of his people in spite of their unfaithfulness, and it runs for 72 verses. Now I won't read it all to you, but I'd encourage you to go and look at that, because it's very a very succinct, should we say, kind of overview of the book of Numbers. It's a commentary really on the book of Numbers. And so let's look at the outline of the book. I'm going to share my screen and bring up some pointers for us to look at, just as by way of overview. So just bear with me 1 second. We want to Okay, so this is our book of Numbers today, Wednesday, 15th of April, and here we go. So, study the book of books. Here we go. So, we're going to look at the summary of the contents, and again, it's split up really into three sections. You've got responsibility, basically dealt with. You've got responsibility on trial, and you've got responsibility, in other words, inheriting. I'm sorry this is a little bit smaller, but I wanted to try and fit it across 3 slides for everyone. I trust that you can see it. By the way, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A, and we'll seek to address them at the end. I had somebody wanting an anonymous question, but they weren't prepared to give any details on Monday night, so I didn't answer it because it wasn't there. So chapters 1 to 8 in Numbers look at responsibility. You have the conflict over the house of God from verse 1 to verse 54. And note within that, all are responsible in this warfare, and the Levites have a special responsibility in that. The second thing that is there is the position of the house of God. and that's in Numbers 2, verse 1 to 34. And what we find in the layout, and this is amazing, is of course the layout of the house of God it's central. All homes are to be in right relations to the dwelling place of God. It doesn't matter which tribe they were in. The centrality of that layout had to be the house of God. And this should be one of the lessons that we draw from this. It's fundamental to our position and our attitude for life. How does my household relate to the household of God, to the house of God? And note that nothing is left to chance or self-will in these chapters, or self-opinion. Everything has its place and its order. Everyone has his function. Every home and business has to be rightly related to the Lord. And then we see from chapter 3, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse 26, the nature of responsibility. And there's obviously the special numbering of the Levites from 3 verse 14 to chapter 1 verse 47 to 50. Let's just take a look at that very quickly, because it's an interesting thing to observe. Numbers 3 verse 14 says, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, saying, Number the children of Levi by their fathers' houses, by their families, every male from a month old and upward shall you number them." And then coming back into Numbers 1 verse 47 to 50, "But the Levites, after the tribe of their fathers, were not numbered among them. For the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Only the tribe of Levi you shall not number, neither shall you take the sum of them among the children of Israel. But appoint you the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony, and over all the furniture thereof, and over all that belongs to it. And they shall bear the tabernacle and all the furniture thereof, and they shall minister unto it, and shall encamp round about the tabernacle." So they weren't numbered with everybody else. They were a separate people. They represent the heart of the matter, warring the warfare and the work. It's identified in Numbers 4 verse 23, where it says this: "From 30 years old and upward until 50 years old shall you number them, all that enter in to wait upon the service, to do the work in the tent of meeting." And then in Numbers 8 verse 24 we have this: "This is that which belongs to the Levites, from 25 years old and upward. They shall go in to wait upon the service in the work of the tent of meeting." So there's a special responsibility here for the tent of meeting. And the Hebrew uses a word connected with war, armies, often translated in the Authorized Version as hosts, keeping the charge, as it says in 8 verse 26. "But you shall minister with their brethren in the tent of meeting, to keep the charge, and shall do no service. Thus shall you do to the Levites touching their charges." They were the ones responsible for bearing the burdens, and that's found in Numbers 4:47. And then we have from chapter 5 verse 1 to 31, looking at responsibility and sin, the leper, trespass against the Lord, jealousy over the wife. So in that passage in Numbers 5, you have a dealing of how they operate with the lepers, and see, both male and female shall you put out without the camp, shall you put them, that they defile not their camp in the midst whereof I dwell. And the children of Israel did so, and put them out without the camp, as the Lord spoke unto Moses. And so you have that function, that responsibility, the trespassing against the Lord. And then we have in chapter 6, verse 1 to 7, verse 88, the motive for taking responsibility, being from the heart of love, freely offered. The Nazarite vow, Numbers 6, verse 1 to 21, freely entered into, but once made it must be wholly observed. And then the prince's offering, which is in chapter 7 from verse 10 to verse 88. That was a free will offering made to the Lord, and it was connected with the altar. All true giving must start with the cross. It is not for self-exhibition or self-advance. I always find it funny when people want to be recognized for their donations, and you go to some museums and there's all these names on the wall. I'm like, if it really wasn't about you, you wouldn't want your name on in neon lights, shall we say. And then you have the responsibility for the lampstand and the Levites' separation, that's from 7 verse 89 to 8 verse 26. And you also have the responsibility for the lampstand, holding the testimony of Jesus. In other words, costs everything. It means an utter separation to the Lord. So that's the first 8 chapters, responsibility being dealt with. I'm just going to type an answer here. It's Psalm 78 is the overview. There you go, Paul. That's a good question. Sorry if I went too fast there. Psalm 78 is the summary of the book of Numbers. And then we have responsibility on trial. So we have a divine provision for the journey in chapters 9 and 10, looking at the Passover, which of course is going on as we speak, the finished work of Christ, which is basic to all of us. We have the pillar of cloud, 9 verse 15-23, the guidance and ministry of the Holy Spirit central. Now, seeing this in the corporate context, so you've got Passover, blood of the Lamb, everything that's been made for the journey has been provided for with the household of God, with the lamb being slain, all of the things within the Passover meal pointing to that reality. The finished work of Christ, basic to all, the pillar of cloud, in other words, the guidance and ministry of the Holy Spirit essential. You can't have these things compartmentalized, they all come into connection. The silver trumpets, which is in chapter 10, and that's the togetherness of God's people is always vital, but not only that, is a responsibility of the church really to sound the warning, and so a responsibility of the whole functioning to be aware and alert of what's going on. Then we have the second section, responsibility and rebellion. So we've got the orderly departure from Mount Sinai, we have the burning fire, the murmuring, 70 elders, quails, and the plague, and how quick we are to murmur in our own lives in this day and age. We have the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron, the spy sent out and the people's reaction, and of course the evil report of 10, and the other spirit of Joshua and Caleb. Moses was tested, the pronouncement that the 10 will die in the wilderness, and the people's presumption on that. Then we have reiteration of chapter 15, verse 1-41, shows the provision for sin, for the sin, the need of utterness, the need for the fringes of blue, stops fraying, and disintegration, the blue to remind them of their heavenly vocation. Again, highlighting just these responsibilities that our people have. Then we have the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, Abiram, which is chapter 16, verse 1-17, verse 2. Note they were Levites and Reubenites who formed this faction. It was a rebellion over government and ministry. The earth swallowed, the fire destroyed. This resulted in the rebellion of the people, and the rod that budded, which was a vindication of the divinely vested authority. I notice someone's got their hand up. Yes, Maureen, can you write your question, Maureen, if there's a question, or if it's to do with what we're currently talking about, and I'll come back to it in a moment. And then you have the provision for the priests and Levites, and the provision made for contact with death, found in chapter 18, verse 1-19, verse 22. The latter provision for the contamination and defilement which come from touch with dead things, in other words, the world. You see, God, how merciful He is that He provides a latter provision for contamination. And when we do touch the dead things of the world, it's truly incredible the lengths that He goes to ensure that we have an opportunity to reach and take hold of Him and the household of God. Miriam dies, people rebel, Moses falls. That's in chapter 20, verse 1-13. And then you have the 3 Canaanite tribes destroyed. People rebel again, fiery serpents, the brazen serpent lifted up in Numbers 21, verse 1-35. And then you have the subtle attempt to deceive Israel. Balaam, people fall, another plague. And these plagues and pestilences that people say, oh, no, it's not God. God doesn't send plagues and pestilences. But you look through Torah, you see actually there is involvement by His hand in this process. And then the last 10 chapters in Numbers 26-36 look at the responsibility, the inheriting. So you have the new generation that is numbered, Numbers 26, 1-65. You have the laws of inheritance implemented. You have the appointment of Joshua, the laws concerning the offerings and vows restated to the new generation. The Midianites are then slaughtered in chapter 31. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh settled down on the wrong side of the Jordan. And isn't that interesting? How I would rather be on the right side of the Jordan than the wrong side. And then we have an overview of the journey in retrospect from chapter 33, verse 1-56, followed by finally the division of Canaan, the Levitical cities, and the cities of refuge. So all that sums up very succinctly the the book, and we'll come in and look at some of the questions in a second. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. And Maureen, are you? Let me give you. The floor is yours, Maureen. Can you? Do you have a question? Your mic should be on. I can unmute you. Just a second. You are, Maureen, can you hear me? There we go. If you want to talk, you can, Maureen. I don't know if you've been unmuted, my end. But if not, we'll lower your hand. I don't know if it was a mistake. So you can write the question out if there is a question, Maureen, but let's move on in that because we didn't hear you there. We want to maximize the time for everybody, not take up too much time. So let's go back to a full screen, and we're going to just look at the message of the book. So God's purpose and longing can never be realized without our growing up and taking full responsibility in his house. And this is something that's very interesting. It's often overlooked. It's not just about our own Jerusalem, as it were, but it's taking responsibility for the household of God. Responsibility, however, requires intensive probation and testing. And we've all failed in those tests, and we've all come through other tests. And we just have to thank God for his grace in allowing us to be involved in this process. You look at Moses' failed tests, and yet he led the people out of Egypt into close to the promised land, and he did actually enter into the promised land with the transfiguration. And so we have the record of the trial and the failure of the people at Kadesh, which means holy, Kadesh Barnea, when they refused to enter the land of their inheritance, which resulted in the consequent judgment on that generation, except for Caleb and Joshua, of course. It also explains the record of murmuring, unbelief, wandering, failure, and disobedience so frequently evidenced in the journey from Kadesh to the plains of Moab. One kind of man was being tested and rejected. Another kind of man was attested, trained, and accepted. It was this kind of man who, by the grace of God, was to inherit the land. We're also taught here that nothing is left to us, to our own wills or to our own opinion or ideas. We see that the Lord is Lord of his house. That hasn't changed, and has absolute and sovereign right over his own. It is this fact more than any other that brings light to the rebellion in us. Nevertheless, given a heart that is for him and a settled life position concerning his dwelling place, concerning his house, he, in faithfulness, will bring us through all the trials of our faith to a full inheritance. And how I thank God for that reality. A couple of books that Lance recommended when he did this study back in the 50s was Notes on Numbers by C.H. Mackintosh and Exodus and the Wandering in the Wilderness by Alfred Edersheim. I'm going to share my screen again with the questions for today, and hopefully these will be a blessing to you as you mull on the book of Numbers. I don't know if you've had opportunity to read the book. Tomorrow we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy, so if you have time between now and then to read the book of Deuteronomy, then please do. So let's just have a look at this very, very briefly. What was it that God wanted Moses and Aaron to find out when he commanded them to number the people in chapter 1? And why do you think this needed to be done? Why is it that Numbers 15 to 20, covering a period of about 37 years, is given so little attention in the book? Read chapter 20, verse 2 to 11, and chapter 21, verse 4 to 9. What do these passages tell you about the Lord Jesus Christ? And then read chapters 3 and 4. What can you find out about responsibility for the things of the Lord from these chapters? Can you see any lessons for us in the church of Jesus Christ in chapters 3 and 4? Why not write a history of murmuring and rebellion as it's found in Numbers 11, giving reasons for the murmurings and rebellings? Can you learn any lessons for the Christian life and for church life from these chapters? And question 6, what can you find out about responsible leadership from the following passages? in Numbers 9, verse 1 to 8, Numbers 11, verse 10 to 17, Numbers 14, verse 1 to 25, Numbers 15, verse 32 to 41, Numbers 16, verse 20 to 24, and 41 to 44, and Numbers 27, verse 1 to 5, and 12 to 23. What do you learn about guidance from Numbers 9, verse 15 to 23, 10, 11 to 13, 34, and 12, verse 5? And why do you think God sent the cloud to cover the tabernacle? We spoke about that briefly earlier. Read chapters 13 and 14 and 33, 50 to 56 and compare Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. Write out some reasons why it is so important that all of us enter into the promises in Christ that God has given to his people. What to you is the most disturbing lesson in the book of Numbers? And equally, what to you is the most comforting lesson in the book of Numbers? What was it that was in the hearts of Joshua and Caleb that caused God to choose them to lead the new generation into the promised land? That's in chapters 13 and 14. And in a few sentences, state how the faithfulness of God is revealed in the book of Numbers. So there's just a few questions for you to mull on. That does conclude our very brief overview of the book of Numbers. I trust it was helpful for you. And tomorrow we're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy at the same time, and that concludes us to finishing the Torah. Are there any questions? Finishing the Pentateuch, of course. Any